Lists in the Limelight, the Dramatis Personae in popular 19th-century playbooks. This talk uses methods of examining parts of published literature rather than the whole work, and reading them outwards as indexes of social phenomena in distinct cultural historical moments. I draw from models of distant reading, perhaps best known in the work of Franco Moretti, whose literary history analyzes large samples, rather than single works, and small elements of certain subgenres. Moretti's distant reading might, for example, use one detail to track the rise of the British nautical drama, such as Buckstone's Dream at Sea. But unlike Moretti, I turn outside the content of the literary work itself to the representations of the work in the preliminary pages. My talk demonstrates that we can read the preliminary matter of a publication as a social product that reveals diverse cultural and historical themes. Dramatis Personae, the list of characters, is one of the texts that surrounds the main work, what Gerard Genette calls paratext in his influential study of that name. It includes title pages and sundry other elements. Here we'll examine the character lists in several plays by one author, John Baldwin Buckstone, whose 19th century oeuvre was prolific, diverse, ranging from comic to serious, and very well published. But while Genette's interpretation of paratext centers on the author's literary intentions, I use one author to demonstrate that the writer was fairly irrelevant to the content and design of the Dramatis Personae, and hence to the meanings it emanates. Or in other words, theatrical paratexts reveal the multiple influences and multiple agents associated with theater and theater publishing. As a footnote, though I did use these samples in archive print copies, the reproductions here come from the same microform set, Red X 19th Century English and American Drama. Character lists appeared in several vehicles, such as the three shown here for Buckstone's play, Dead Shot. One was the manuscript play, used for backstage preparations or submitting to censorship offices. Another was the playbill, posted in public, which was related to the program given to audiences. And a third was the printed playbook. These vehicles were closely related, and they developed partly in tandem, yet they were composed for different readers and different functions, and hence they differed in components and design. All listed the names of the characters of the drama, while playbills in a majority of published plays listed the names of actors who played the roles in specific productions, commonly the premiere. Especially from street playbills, the public was familiar with these forms. That is, the reading public was literate not only in the sense of recognizing names, but of interpreting rows and columns or X and Y axes, correlating a fictional character, Captain Cannon in the left column, to the real-world performer, Mr. Gallet, who enacted the role. A list involves selection and hierarchy, and hence reveals values and priorities. The Dramatis Personae could emit multiple kinds of information, emphasizing various aspects of character, staging, or actors. These communication priorities and functions changed across versions and editions of the same play, as illustrated by the trajectory of Buckstone's The Dream at Sea. The first London publisher of The Dream at Sea used a fairly standard model, labeling the element with the Latin name, Dramatis Personae, using kerning in the second word, a name that bestowed traditional literary value to a popular stage play at a time when new drama held just middling status as literature. In layout, it is a two-column table, though not inscribed by boundary lines or boxes, but it does lead readers across rows with spacious dotted lines, and it clusters groups with brackets. What is the sequence of the character names? As usual, gender is the paramount category. Male roles are placed first, even minor male roles placed above important female roles. Within each gender, the sequence is usually arranged by rank in the real social world, not in the theatrical importance of the play. Thus, the wealthy mine owner here comes before his nephew, or the village muffin man, even if he is not the hero of the play. The ranking is often represented by character descriptions, which are distinguished typographically by italics. The descriptive phrases, such as a fisherman, a smuggler, Black Ralph's wife, were usually brief, and they described a social role, or social relations, rather than a unique personality, in contrast to drama after modernism. This marks one way that this simple list, the Dramatis Personae, reflects and reinforces a culture's conception of literary characterization, which in turn links to ideologies about people and social identity in the real world. At the right, the actors are represented by surnames. Here there is no first name or initials, although these do sometimes appear in other plays, and all performers are granted an honorific title, Mr. and Mrs. and so on. Overall, the structure was the predominant format, but these details varied widely, even among nearby London publishers. In the second London publication of The Dream at Sea, the Dramatis Personae became fused with the costume list. In content and visual design, it centers on costumes. The passages contain sequences of elaborate detail, such as iron gray wig for Trevanion, or gray flowered waistcoat for Tommy Tinkle. In format, the size of each row is determined by the length of that costume description. The actor name is connected by a bracket, not directly linked to the character, but to the costume description. The printer's dotted lines are not visual guides from the role to the actor, but aesthetic filler to square out the passage. Why emphasize costumes like this? At one level, the description served a practical, future-oriented function as a guide for staging future productions. At another level, it was a record of what actors and actresses wore, a verbal portrait of their performance on stage. It's also important to remember the pleasure of reading material culture before the proliferation of cheap mass-produced goods. Costume descriptions provided part of the entertainment and appeal of playbooks, and hence were what we would now call added value components for publishers. Costumes mattered in almost all playbooks, but were usually formatted as a separate list, as in these two editions of a different Buckstone play, Presumptive Evidence, where the costume list appears above or below the Dramatis Personae. Returning to The Dream at Sea, the play was reprinted in the United States, as were many popular English plays and publications. This publisher listed the costumes separately elsewhere, and reproduced the same elements of the Dramatis Personae of the first London edition in the same format, listing the cast of the London premiere with brief role descriptions and similar typography. But this publisher added an American production, the cast of a show in Philadelphia, naming the city at the top of the column, as was customary. Why record a production from Philadelphia? The city was an important hub in the U.S. cultural landscape, but it was also the home of this publisher, and publishers often promoted the theaters in their own city, perhaps as cultural boosterism, and also to maintain relations with theaters and their managers, who provided them with copies of new play scripts. Actually, the publisher adds two American productions, both in Philadelphia, relocating the London premiere to the last far-right column. Though most tables did follow chronological sequence, chronology was malleable or dispensable in the face of other criteria besides time. Besides merely adding multiple American productions, the publisher altered the format. The design is a more explicit table structure, albeit still without lines. It uses the row guides, the dotted lines, but only from the characters of the first cast listed, the second column. It does not continue those guide dots across the columns. This would become a common format. We also see ditto marks where the honorific title Mr. is repeated. Using ditto marks would free up typepieces, the M and the R, for other jobs. They were used more for men's because Mr. was consistent, whereas women's honorific titles, Miss, Mrs., Madame, were varied and didn't repeat as often. We also see here some blank spaces in the right side columns, which could indicate one of several things. An actor played multiple roles, or actors' names were not recorded, or minor roles were dropped from certain productions, though these designs almost never explain their own codes, leaving them implicit or presumed. The Dream at Sea moved on. The printers of the second American edition did not reprint, but composed anew, changing the label to the vernacular term, cast of characters, and restoring the London premiere to the first production column. This edition changed the record of American productions, dropping Philadelphia entirely and adding several in Boston, which happened to be the home of this publisher. This format was typical of reprints of British plays by successful American play publishers, keeping the London premiere, which added an imprimatur or cultural capital to the playbook, adding multiple American productions, especially those representing the publisher's own city. Also, in these editions, the format often made the table structure visible and explicit, in this instance by column lines, as tables were becoming more common in other arenas of the industrializing society, such as timetables for trains. This Boston publisher expanded the table to a second row, repeating the character list in the left column, and thus recording even 12 productions from several cities. That is, almost 12 in this instance. One column in the lower row is labeled for a Boston production, but left blank. This is the kind of aberration that one finds in surprising frequency across 19th century playbooks, a reminder that the industrial capitalism's push toward rationalization was not always steady and successful. The Dream at Sea moved on to New York, where the third American publisher reprinted the large Dramatis Personae table, filling in the blank column. In this table format, the Dramatis Personae shifted emphasis from characters, or costumes, to the record of significant stage productions, implying that the value and identity of a play lay in its trajectory of staging, its embodiment by actors in separate theatrical events, different from a model based in the aesthetic vision of the author. Unlike the British convention, these U.S. imprints diluted the value of the original staging, the premiere. Instead, the table, in its content, structure, and visual design, conveys a value in series, in multiple variants, suggestive of the theater tour, and also echoing qualities of industrial mass production that was permeating printing and other industries in the era. The proportion of 1 or 2 London productions alongside 8 to 10 American productions suggests a national cultural identity, America's roots in and continual interaction with the older English traditions, yet also its aspirations of autonomy and perhaps even equality, values that seem characteristic of the young country's post-colonial status. The record of production also conveyed a map of the cultural cartography inside the nation, charting the network of cultural hubs. Besides the usual listing of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, some tables also recorded shows from other cities, such as Charleston, South Carolina, represented here, and the blank column, which had been intended for a Boston show, was filled with a cast from Providence, Rhode Island. When reprinting British plays, certain American publishers preserved some English conventions, the London premiere, brief character descriptions, and gender hierarchy, among others. Yet by expanding the list beyond the original production to a series of shows, they rendered a simple character and cast list, or a list centered on costumes, into a semi-historical documentation of a series of productions that conveyed the geographic travels of a play and at the same time the network of key nodes in the growing nation's cultural landscape. The tabulated columns, in both quantity and in visual style, reflected the expansion of literacy in the industrial age, which was adapting to new and varied modes of presenting and reading information. The fact that some of this information on this sample is covered by a library stamp reflects the disregard for paratexts and for this type of Dramatis Personae in particular. Indeed, this elaborate format would soon be supplanted by the simple modern layout which separates the main list of characters from the record of the original cast, with no other productions. Still, the variations of Dramatis Personae from this era can be read by us as historical documents that index large social and cultural phenomena, including the material and economic practices of theater, printing, and publishing, as well as the cultural values associated with literary characters, genders, actors, cultural institutions, cities, and even nations.